So I start with Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you, in the name of Allah, the most compassionate and the most merciful. I'd like to start my talk by telling you a little bit about the scholarship of recent years on Islam, women and gender. This scholarship has been increasingly conducted in the last 2 decades by women who are Muslim or of Muslim background, like me. This has made it possible for Muslim women academics to refocus, expand, and transform Islamic studies, sometimes against the will of many who do conventional Islamic studies. However, they have to challenge, these Muslim women academics and scholars have had to challenge the denigration of their scholarship in academia as advocacy. So they are accused of being advocates of a confessional agenda, or as too liberal and too feminist when they are speaking in traditional circles. But despite these challenges, there is a kind of wide recognition that there needs to be more inclusive models of knowledge production for women to participate in, and for Muslim women to participate in the production of knowledge about Islam or Islamic knowledge that is more theologically oriented. In the slides that I have for you, I'd like to explore the fruits of some of these recent studies. So one of the interesting things that have come out of scholarship on gender, women, and Islam is an exploration of what women contributed to Islamic knowledge in the past. And these are some of the recent books that some of you might be familiar with. Al-Muhaddithat by Akram Nadwi, Knowledge in Islam, Women and Knowledge in Islam by Asma Saeed, Women in Islamic Biographical Collections by Ruth Wadad. And these studies tell us about women's role in the transmission and construction of the Islamic tradition. Al-Muhaddithat by Akram Nadwi, for example, gives us an overview, a survey of the thousands of women, including the wives of the Prophet, who helped and contributed to creating the prophetic canon. So, for example, Aisha, wife of the Prophet, produced or transmitted 2,210 hadiths. And she didn't just transmit. Some of these transmissions are her own interpretation of prophetic practice or life with the Prophet, or Quranic references. She also contested some of the male interpretations. And that continues down the years and the centuries. By the 5th century, we have a scholar called Shuhd al-Katiba, about whom there is a chapter in one of the 3 books that I introduced at the beginning. Shuhd al-Katiba was a calligrapher and a hadith scholar who taught until the age of 90 in the Mosque of Baghdad in the 6th century of Islam and the 11th century of the Common Era. Here she's portrayed as sitting on the pulpit in the mosque in a famous literary work produced in the following century. There's, in the 16th century, Aisha al-Ba'uniyya, whose book hasn't been studied yet, but has been authored and edited. It's called The Principles of Sufism, where she presents a whole theology of love based on her understanding and reception of the various Islamic traditions. There is Sarah, a lesser-known scholar, Sarah bint Ali ibn Abd al-Kafi al-Subki, a 15th century scholar who is both a transmitter of prophetic tradition and a jurist in her own right, who has, according to this manuscript, signed a religious ruling or a juristic ruling in her own name. So the point I'm trying to make is that women across the centuries contributed to the production of Islamic knowledge. And women's role in academia today in the study of gender, women, and Islam has also been about revealing that aspect of Islamic history and presenting a model forward to change scholarship on Islam to take account, to become cognizant of the role of women. And this can be grounded in theological works which permitted women to engage in theology and scriptural interpretation. For example, Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, an 11th century Iraqi scholar, talks about the importance of permitting women to do fiqh. Fiqh is Islamic jurisprudence, that there is no obstacle to them engaging in this Islamic discipline. But the quote that I personally have a soft spot for, and I try to include in many of my talks because I think it's worth reflection upon, is by the Egyptian and Shafi'i Syrian scholar An-Nawawi from Damascus. He wrote a book on the rules of producing religious rulings, in which he actually argued that provided that the religious scholar or the jurist has acquired all these conditions, for example, that they are an adult Muslim, that adult Muslim is trustworthy, pure from corruption or moral faults, who possesses a perceptive mind, exact in action, accurate in reasoning, and generally attentive. It does not matter if that person is free, a slave, woman, or a blind person. And the jurist who acquires all these conditions can actually become an independent jurist, somebody who does not belong to a school of thought. So if they have reached that level of knowledge, they can actually establish their own school of thought. So that gate is there in the Islamic tradition for women. And yet we see such silence. And we have women who transmitted the prophetic tradition, some writings by some women theologians, but the contribution is so small in comparison with the possibilities. And we see today contemporary shifts. So, for example, many women now are doing Islamic studies in the traditional way. Colleges have sprung up across the Muslim world and in minority contexts where women are studying the traditional disciplines. And as they do this, they are partaking in traditional structures of knowledge, but also contributing to pushing the boundaries to some extent. We have seen a revival of Islamic education in general, but I could say that some of the colleges I have seen which are mixed, the majority have been women, including colleges in London which are specialized in Islamic education. This is an image not from the mosque in Manchester where I live. This is an image of Al-Azhar, which is a major Sunni university in Cairo. And I was just passing by, and with no intention to do any research on gender, but forever the academic, I wanted to catch this moment of women studying and teaching in the whole of the mosque of Al-Azhar, with their male teachers and female teachers mixing with the men. That image is very inspiring. And yet, the question that I ask, and this is inspired both through my work and through questions that my daughter asked me when she was 4 and 5 and 6 and 7. So, if women are now partaking in Islamic knowledge, we know that they partook in Islamic knowledge in the past, but the impact is difficult to map out, whether it's the literary legacy of the women or the impact on the ideas. What about women today? How can we push the boundaries of Islamic knowledge, whether we are Muslim or non-Muslim, working in academia or in confessional educational context? What more can we do? And the reason I've asked this question is obvious. I'm a Muslim woman myself. But one day my daughter Maryam came to me back from the Islamic Arabic school and said, You know, today I felt so embarrassed because you lied to me. And I said, how did I lie to you? I don't think I'd lied to you. And she said, well, my teacher, her female teacher, asked her if she knows any prophets of Islam. And she said, Maryam. And the teacher told her there are no female prophets in Islam. And I've always known that there are debates about female prophets in Islam. And I've told my daughter that Mary, mother of Jesus, is perceived as a female prophetess. So when she took that knowledge to her Islamic Arabic school, that knowledge was undermined as completely outside Islamic doctrine, as incorrect. So I've started doing more research over the years, trying to write a book about debates on female prophethood in Islam. So while this might come across as a bit textual, something of an intellectual history, maybe convoluted arguments amongst theologians in some bygone days, but these ideas, this history actually impacts lives and prevents many from remodeling themselves or remodeling their spirituality and morality in ways that are more open than the existing models. So, dedicated to my daughter, I start this case study on female prophethood, trying to trace the debate and whether actually we can say that there is a consensus women can't be prophets. And why that is important? Because prophecy is a form of agency that has been given to men in Islam and other Abrahamic traditions. It's a kind of divine election. If women were excluded from that, that is actually a serious issue to contend with as believing women. So to start with, the conventional Muslim conception that my daughter confronted is that prophethood in Islam is conditional upon maleness. A representative articulation of this view can be found in a treatise by a Persian scholar from the 14th century called Al-Nasafi. By the way, I've made a list of some of the scholars I'll mention so that you can follow the names. This is in order of their appearance. I might not mention all of them if there are time constraints. So they are not in chronological order. So Al-Nasafi, the first one, Abu al-Barakat al-Nasafi, a Persian scholar, he argues that there aren't any women prophets because prophethood is conditional upon maleness. In the opening paragraph of his discussion on the characteristics of prophethood, he instructs the reader to know that the prophet must be male. For anybody who knows Arabic, he says ذَكَرًا. Al-Nasafi explains this precondition on grounds of the public nature of prophetic responsibility, such as promulgation of a call to belief in God and the proclamation of proof, such as a miracle, something to prove the prophecy. He then purports that femaleness is incongruent with that. And he says it's incongruent with that based on the Quran, where it says in chapter 33, Surah Al-Ahzab, or the chapter of the clans, verse 33, remain in your houses, speaking to the wives of the Prophet, that is. Remain in your houses and display not your finery as did the pagans of old, and perform the prayer and pay the alms and obey God and his messenger. People of the house, God only desires to put away from you abomination and to cleanse you. Although the whole passage in chapter 33 from verse 28 until verse 33 is addressing the Prophet's wives in particular, the verse I read out is extended to all Muslim women as an ideal, as normative. Women should remain at home. So if women should remain at home, how could God send them to have a public role as messengers to people? mean, messengerhood can involve divine prophecy, but messengerhood in a very broad sense can involve scholarship as well. Al-Nasafi's view merits further unpacking. One of the things, of course, is his reading of the Quranic verse, "Remain in your homes," is only one of the recitations, but he presents it as a consensus. Suffice it to observe that Al-Nasafi presents this as the correct doctrine of the people who follow Prophet Muhammad's tradition. But digging into the Sunni theological tomes doesn't sustain this view. The more I looked, the more I found proof of major disagreements, not only about women prophets, but also about the nature of prophecy and prophethood itself. There are so many conceptions of prophethood, even within the Sunni tradition, even within the same school of the Sunni tradition. The Sunni tradition is the largest denomination in the Muslim world. So there is abundant evidence that before Al-Nasafi, the terms of the debate were markedly different. Nobody asked, is gender important for the case for a person to become a prophet? The question was different. So the terms of the debate shifted over time. For example, in early classical systematic theology, the idea of women prophets is often tackled more openly. So the question was not dismissed, and it often occurred not as a discussion of the characteristics and gender of the prophet, but more in the discussion about how we can prove prophecy. And this was a debate that I can't fully explain today, but it was a debate against the philosophers in particular, who didn't see prophecy as important and who considered human reason enough to discern what is good and what is bad and to discern the truth in general. So in key works, looking at one of the renowned key works of systematic theology, the opposition to female prophecy doesn't turn on gender at all. Scholars such as Al-Juwayni, is number 2, who represents a major classical theological school called Al-Asha'ira, his argument relies on historical silence. So he doesn't make gender a condition of prophecy. Rather, he says, we don't know of any woman who proclaimed herself to be a prophet. So even women who had miracles, and we have Mary, mother of Jesus, or Maryam, who is associated with miracles in the Quran, but does she anywhere in the Quran say that these miracles are proof of her prophecy? In that case, Al-Juwayni says, well, she was silent, so we can't consider her a female prophet. So the exclusion from prophecy is not a denial that women could be miracle workers. He accepts that Maryam is a miracle worker. Rather, it turns on a distinction between prophetic and saintly miracles. Since she didn't call herself a prophet, then this must be a manifestation of her saintliness or special status. And further proof is the people of the cave who are mentioned in the Quran as having manifested a miracle, but that was never associated with a claim that they were prophets. So in a way, this classical position leaves us with the possibility that, unbeknownst to us, there may have been women prophets that the Quran has not mentioned. There may have been women prophets who proclaimed miracles as proof of their prophecy, but the Quran hasn't mentioned them. The Quran itself says that it doesn't tell the stories of all prophets. The reason for this more open position in classical theology comes from the very conception of prophecy as turning on miracles. Miracle, or the miracle has to be, there has to be a miracle, and the miracle has to be a proof of prophecy. And the ideal representation of this is Prophet Jesus and Prophet Moses. And unique and marvelous miracles like those of Maryam do exist. But if the miracle hasn't been announced as proof of the prophecy, then it can't be taken as such. And there are many scholars who accepted that view across the schools of thought. The rationalists and the traditionalists, they were so concerned with the proof being proclaimed. So, did anybody diverge from that wide view of prophethood and miracles in early Islam, which is not intended to exclude women as that later articulation I mentioned, but rather the exclusion of women from prophecy is a byproduct of the nature of the argument, and also is not categorical in denying that women could have been miracles, could have been prophets. Are there scholars who diverge? Yes. And scholars who diverge from these essentializations take a different approach anchored in the Quran. So rather than adopting systematic theology, they develop hermeneutics based on the Quran's language. So instead of reading an external, already formulated idea about prophethood and then finding evidence from the Quran, they start from the Quran's understanding of prophecy and the language surrounding prophecy, which one might call the conceptual grammar of Islam, of the Quran. One of these scholars is Ibn Hazm. He's number 4. As the Makhshari, just to say why he's here, because he represents the rationalist school, the Mu'tazili school, for those who know the history of Islamic theology, who also agreed with Al-Juwayni about what constitutes prophecy and why women are to be excluded. So Ibn Hazm is an Andalusian scholar who belonged to a school that took the Quran and prophetic tradition seriously and developed a theology that is grounded in a hermeneutics of the text. So Ibn Hazm starts from arguing that the lack of evidence, the lack of historical evidence, cannot be taken to represent a view on female prophethood. And he writes a treatise called The Prophethood of Women, which is one of the very few expositions dedicated entirely to the question at hand. He argues that there are key terms and occurrences in the Quran that actually go against that consensus that there were no women that we know of who were prophets. He argues, for example, that the Quran mentions a dialogue, recounts a dialogue between Abraham's wife, Sarah, and the angels in chapter 11, Surah Hud, in which she is given news of Isaac and Jacob. So Abraham's wife is talking to the angels. It's not simply a privilege of being a prophet's wife, as he will say and argue. He also mentions that the mother of Moses was divinely instructed in chapter 28, Surah Al-Qasas, to cast her son into the water. And more clearly, on another occasion, in Surah Taha, chapter 20, verse 38, she's cast as having received revelation to cast her son into the water. So the word revelation is associated with her. Ibn Hazm considers this clear evidence that she received divine revelation. Which mother would cast her child into the water without certainty that they will be saved? And certainty cannot be achieved without revelation. Like Moses' mother and Abraham's wife, Maryam is given news about her purification and election by the angels, and then she's visited by Angel Gabriel to be given glad tidings of Jesus. Employing all these Quranic citations as attesting these women's prophethood, Ibn Hazm says that the whole point of the word for prophethood in Arabic, nubuwa, which comes from naba'a, is to receive news, is to have news communicated. So fundamentally, lexically, prophethood in Arabic means receiving news, divine news or revelation. And unlike the Persian scholars I've talked about so far, who all lived in the eastern part of the Muslim world and who conceptualized prophethood in missionary terms, prophethood as persuading, converting, and publicly proclaiming miracles, for Ibn Hazm, the most important component of prophethood is prophecy, not doing all these public roles, but prophecy itself. And the objections against Mary and Mary's prophethood, that, for example, she doesn't proclaim herself a prophet, not just Ibn Hazm, but even other scholars such as the 14th century Damascene scholar Ibn Taymiyyah, his name is not here, I wasn't planning to mention him, they say this idea, it comes from outside the Quran. There's no evidence in the Quran that somebody needs to say, I bring forth a miracle and this is proof of my prophethood. And that's a convoluted theological argument. Rather, the Quran talks of revelation. So Ibn Hazm says that those who object to Mary as being a female prophet have no grounds, have no Quranic grounds. And those who say that, in fact, the Quran designates her as a person of truth, an Arabic word, siddiqa, that this doesn't exclude her from being a female prophet, because Joseph, in chapter 12 of the Quran, who is a prophet, clearly designated as a prophet, is also described with the same term. If anything, prophethood and being a person of truth are intertwined. The Quran says about Mary, or about Jesus, the Messiah, son of Mary, was only a messenger. Messengers before him passed away. His mother was a woman of truth. They both ate food. So Ibn Hazm finds attestation in the Quran many times that being a person of truth is actually a station of excellence in the eyes of God that is concomitant to prophethood. And that being a person of truth indicates moral and spiritual perfection, which is a prerequisite of prophethood, and has been achieved by Maryam. And not only Maryam, according to the Quran, the Pharaoh's wife has also achieved perfection. And if we go by the prophetic tradition, there is Khadija, the first wife of the Prophet. Another Andalusian scholar who belonged to the mainstream school of Al-Juwayni agreed with Ibn Hazm that going by Quranic evidence, all the terms surrounding Maryam echo the status of prophethood, purification, election, being a person of truth, being purified, being given miracles. All of these terms and, let's say, concepts of prophethood occur surrounding Mary with such an intensity that Al-Qurtubi, he was a Cordoban exegete from the 7th century, cannot deny what the Quran is saying about Maryam as a female prophet. In fact, he says toward the end of his exposition of verse 42, chapter 3 of the Quran, Surah Al-Imran, he says, Maryam to women is like Muhammad to men. So in her prophethood, she is to women what Prophet Muhammad is to men. So this parallel is quite powerful, to think of a woman capable of being compared to Prophet Muhammad in this way. The point often made when I speak of Ibn Hazm and Al-Qurtubi is that they were actually atypical or exceptional. that their ideas was born out of a theology that was progressive, because medieval Muslim society in Cordoba, specifically both of them were from Cordoba, was a bit lax. After all, Cordoba is often characterized by having had greater freedoms for women at the time than elsewhere in the Muslim world. And Ibn Hazm was a contemporary of the famous Andalusian princess Wallada. Does anybody know Wallada here? No? So Wallada was a daughter of an Umayyad caliph, so toward the end of the golden period of Muslim Spain in the early 4th century. Her romantic escapades are well known in the historical accounts. She was a poetess herself, and she even inscribed on her gown the poetic lines, "I am by God fit for high positions." Highest positions she imagined to be hers to take. "And I walk on my way with great pride and offer my cheek to whomever desires to kiss it." So this was considered scandalous even in Cordoba, but it also indicates, and it wasn't just Wallada who was a female poetess, but it also indicates that women saw themselves as able to aspire to the highest position and to freely express themselves. But I want to, perhaps toward the end of my talk, to draw attention to a much earlier scholar. Because Ibn Hazm wasn't influenced by the progressive Cordoban society and let's say, the prominent agency of women in cultural life in Muslim Spain. If we go back to the 3rd century of Islam, which would be the 9th century of the Common Era, we have Abu Uthman al-Jahiz, a polymath from al-Basra, Iraq, a rationalist scholar like al-Zamakhshari from the Mu'tazilite school. His legacy covers all Islamic disciplines. In fact, we can say that he can be credited with bringing forth the idea of the miracle as proof of prophecy. He has written one of the earliest treatises on proofs of prophethood to argue against Christian theologians and rationalist philosophers who denied prophecy that Prophet Muhammad's miracles are evident. And he coined the term burhan, proof. Why do I mention al-Jahiz? It's like I've gone to Cordoba and I've mentioned al-Nasafi in the 14th century. Why am I going back to the 9th century? Because I want to draw your attention to the fact that the whole debate about women's prophethood and the place of women in Islamic cosmology, as it were, or in Islamic understanding of the relationship between humanity and the divine, is ongoing and can be traced back to those early roots. And Maryam's uniqueness and the appeal of Maryam as a figure that represents this connection with the divine, that role, that unique role she was given by the divine, that this goes back to the, let's say, to the ground of Islamic intellectual life, whether it was theological or literary or hermeneutic, especially in connection with the Quran. So Al-Jahiz doesn't say that Maryam is a prophet of God. But he writes in a book, in a polemic book against Christian theologians, an epistle on women. So in that theological treatise, which is polemical, that engages with Christian theologians, trying to prove that Prophet Muhammad is a true prophet, he comes up with a chapter or an epistle on women. And under that, he includes a section entitled, "God created a child from a woman without a male spouse and did not create a child from a man without a female spouse." It's a very long title in Arabic. I've tried my best with the translation. Al-Jahith describes this as a marvelous miracle and an outstanding proof, burhan. So I've taken you back to that old language before Ibn Hazm. Something given to women only. And using the terminology of systematic Muslim theology, he says, or unambiguously references this to be something so unique to women that it gives them a degree above men. That's not Cordoba. This is Basra in the 9th century. So Al-Jahith cannot be accused of sloppily using the term burhan, since he himself coined it. He wrote one of the early treatises to argue for the burhan, or the proof of Prophet Muhammad's prophethood, when he uses that term to describe Maryam as having a burhan that marks her uniqueness and that of all women above men in this particular way, that particular way being God's choice of a woman to be given the most marvelous miracle of the virginal conception. Then what he's saying is quite fascinating about how early Muslims actually understood, or had an open horizon as they understood the question of gender and prophecy. Now, jumping forward, or leaping forward, many, many centuries, I would say that these early favorable views, the conflicted opinions, all of these different nuances about what constitutes prophecy was not specific to Andalusia for sure, and was never consolidated into any form of consensus either way. But it opened the possibility for even the most conservative scholars, like Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, the last on my list, who is known as the authority on explaining the sound collection of prophetic tradition called Al-Bukhari. Ibn Hajar says if we understand prophecy or prophethood as turning on prophecy or receiving revelation, then we have a tradition that says for women receiving revelation and also being conditional upon moral perfection, then we have 4 women in the prophetic tradition who achieved perfection: Maryam, Asya, the wife of the Pharaoh, and the superiority, according to the tradition, the superiority of Aisha to all women is like the superiority of Tharid, which is a dish, to all dishes. Ibn Hajar considers it actually plausible based on the prophetic tradition and this understanding of the idea of prophethood as prophecy coming to somebody who has achieved moral perfection. Now, I've taken you on a journey. Maybe I've confused you with all the theological terms. The point that I'm trying to make is that one of the salient features of this debate is that scholars from the formative to the early modern period continue to address this question in the various religious disciplines across the multiple genres of writing. And I have a list of another 20, but I thought we don't have the time for that today. I'm writing a book about it. So the salient feature of this debate is that it does not attempt to close down the possibility of women prophets. Even those who are articulating correct doctrine that prophethood is conditional upon maleness, they, in their arguments, in the detail of their arguments, they are trying to contend against all these different views. So in a way, by making those points about, or trying to exclude women from the possibility of receiving prophecy, by mentioning all the other views, they reinscribe them in the debate, and the debate remains alive. So the final question that I want to leave you with, so what's the point of going back to all this tradition? Why don't we render the slate clean and start afresh? That is because in the reality of religious practice, children, women, and many others will come against views that will sound like they are correct and most authoritative and based on consensus. So we need to, in order to challenge these models which are exclusionary, we need to develop not just a new theology, because that's easy to dismiss, but also an understanding of theology that is far more open to allowing women and others, or women and all believers within the community, to develop more inclusive models. So at this point, I think it's time for you to ask questions, and maybe you can try to push the boundaries of this theological thought by making suggestions, further suggestions as to where else you might think I should look, what other topics you think I need to be trying to deconstruct. Thank you very much.
Really fascinating lecture, especially going through all these great historical, traditional figures. And I think these traditional figures, as great as they would have been influenced by the culture of their time, which would have been male-dominated. And maybe that was the external influence which made them come to that view that there can be female prophets. But as you say, Ibn Hazm countered that by going to the Quran itself and showing that it couldn't be ruled out. And actually, as a suggestion, it reminded me of a lecture I listened to on YouTube recently called Female Archetypes in the Quran. And it talked about, if we go, maybe the best way of countering these historical traditional view is acknowledge the strengths in them, but appreciate that the weakness in them is that they would have been influenced by their culture of their time, but that the Quran is free of these kind of cultural influences, and it actually portrays many women in the Quran in a really positive, strong way. And people, as you mentioned, that the mother of Moses and Maryam and even the Queen of Sheba is portrayed in a really positive light, actually. And actually, the Quran is actually devoid of the negative representation of Eve in the Quran as well. So, and I just want to say it is really fascinating talk, and thank you for. I just wondered if you thought about any other examples in the Quran of women in the Quran which could strengthen the argument as well.
Thank you. Thank you. That's an excellent question, because I can say a bit more about why I'm doing what I'm doing. I said something toward the end about should we render the slate clean and start afresh. I think there has been fantastic scholarship on women in the Quran and gender and women in the Quran and different angles to engaging with women figures in the Quran and gendered agencies in the Quran. And I've supervised several PhD theses on the topic. But I guess to be able to expand and promote a more egalitarian understanding, we have to engage with the tradition that so many hold on to. The work of people like Amina Wadoud and Asma Ballas and many others has been inspiring, but it has always been accused of being outside the tradition, although I would say, given their linguistic engagement, they are actually within the very heart of the tradition, but they don't engage or take on board the dominant views. I find that the politics of knowledge is very sensitive in Islamic contexts. And one of the ways that I think a more productive politics could be is, in my experience, is to say, you can't claim that to be a consensus, because it was never proclaimed as a consensus across time and in various Islamic works of renown and authority. And I can point out where, in reality, when I'm faced with that, the view of a consensus or the view of exclusion is just rooted in some, let's say, imagined idea of tradition. So in pushing against the imagined idea of tradition, we need to see what the tradition actually says. Yes, they were the products of their own times. That actually strengthens the argument. If they were the products of their own time, in a male-centered patriarchal context, why didn't they all exclude women in the end from prophecy? Why didn't they biologically indict all women? It would have been much easier. In fact, many of them took the Quran seriously. Many of them could not talk with certitude about women not being female prophets or not being anything. So the disagreement suggests that, the tradition wasn't just the product of patriarchy, as it were, but there are things that spoke from the Quran to people, and we can get glimpses of that. The reason I say this also is a personal, let's say, theological stance, and it's a simple one. If the Quran was never understood until modernity, so if the idea of gender equality is Quranic, and that has never been understood at all, and it's such an important principle, then that says something about the Quran and not just its interpreters. So I would like to think that no generation of interpreters manages to embrace or capture the full meaning of the Quran, but certainly glimpses of fundamental principles must be present in the various receptions of the Quran, whether it's Quran exegesis or kalam, which is systematic theology, or any other discipline. I hope that you don't mind the long-winded answer. I saw Humaira has raised her hand that I don't know who.
Sorry, just wait for the mic 1 second.
Does that answer your question?
Lovely to listen to you after a very long time. Of course, it's lovely to hear your overview of the different arguments about women and prophethood. But the question that I have on my mind since I can remember is something went wrong very early, right? And very early on, I know there are some scholars who say we've actually never had Islam because Islam was never really implemented properly after the rightly guided Khalifs and everything. So it opens, if you take that line, therefore, if we never really had Islam implemented properly, then what is it that we're living and what is it that we should be living? So there's a big...
Or could have.
Or what could, yeah. So therefore, this is a question I'm exploring myself at the moment. But the question I have on the issue of gender, which is something I've been involved myself for a long time, is I've got to the point, I've done all the angry and all the this and that and all that bit, I've done that, I've overcome that.
I'm sure it comes back.
Yeah, it comes back periodically. There are some red flags here and there. But the question I have is that we spend a lot of our time sort of being defensive against male exclusivism, which is right. I'm not saying that as a negative thing, but they've put us in a position where we're constantly having to prove ourselves. And to be honest, I'm tired of having to prove ourselves, because it's there, it's clear, you've given the arguments for it. We don't have to keep proving it. But the other question that I have is, if we were to have implemented what I certainly feel is more what the Quranic and prophetic message is, what would that look like? I don't think it looks like what we have today, right? And I think what role do women have? Because I think that women are trying so hard to compete with men, to have this kind of equality in the image of men, but we're losing what it is that actually women bring to the table. And you mentioned these potential prophetic figures. So what did they bring to the table? Were they the same as men? Were they different? And if there was a conversation happening between men and women of equal participation in a theological, spiritual sense, what does that look like? What would that be like? How would we be living if that was actually happening?
There's so many questions. and delivered so eloquently. I was hypnotized. Exactly. How would it look like if we live according to...
Female liberal?
Not really, because many of them do just as many crazy things. I have no expectations there necessarily, unless they fulfill the criteria that you're giving and contribute something new.
I think I'll take you to the image from Al-Azhar. This was taken last summer I should have added an image from Ramadan. I spent Ramadan in Cairo, and I went for the nightly prayers. And again, the main hall of Al-Azhar was full of women. I think and that's probably something I'm also guilty of. We put too much emphasis on the text and the intellectual life of the Islamic tradition, and less emphasis on the practice. And we have very little historical knowledge of how Muslims practiced and what women contributed to faith and a life of faith and spirituality, everyday spirituality. I can't reconstruct that just off of the top of my head, but I can reconstruct my experiences of Muslim women's spirituality today, especially with increasing levels of knowledge and engagement with the text. That's unprecedented. The number of women reading and studying Islamic text is increasing exponentially all over the world. I'm not saying that this necessarily leads to more, let's say, more inclusive models, but it will certainly have some impact on the emerging questions, on the different types of practices. So one thing that I felt during those prayers, in between, I met many women who had degrees in Islamic theology, who were commenting and correcting the way the Imam recited the Quran and explaining the recitations and sharing knowledge and moving amongst the men. And actually, some of them were teachers of the men who were at the prayers in other contexts and were giving them instructions. I feel that these models of practice, this is within an educational, let's say, within a scholarly milieu. But after I left those nightly prayers, I just went around in the square in Old Cairo, where there were many women sat around the shrines of members of the Prophet's family. And they too had their vivid spirituality, which has completely constructed the landscape or the public square in a way that gives them central place. And they were talking about their visions, their dreams, their understanding of the world, how they support each other materially, socially, etc. I think we've reduced what women have contributed and can contribute to a set of ideas and a set of texts and a set of interpretations. So that's one thing that I'm grappling with, because in the end, I'm an academic and I'm trying to work within the parameters of academia, but there's so much more to life in faith that women contribute in real life and actually change the world around them, including men. But tracing that, we need both ethnographers and theologians.
That's really very interesting. And similarly, I've seen some things online about this. I'm no expert at all. But one thing I did feel that it's worth saying is that very often we're blind to the lens that we're being asked these questions or these issues are being raised. And if the lens that we're looking at Islamic scholarship and the place of women in prophecy is through a Western lens, I think that so much can be so distorted and misunderstood, because if there were 124,000 prophets or however many there were, and as you say, some tremendous women in Islam, then there's also, I think there must be something much more fluid than firm definitions or even the need to extract anything too precise, because there is nobility and greatness in all people, men and women. And what I wonder, I hear about lectures I've listened to about women that were teaching, and this goes to your point about what maybe the expansion of the notion of women, not just in terms of prophecy, but in terms of nobility and greatness and women of light, basically. So the women that were known to be teachers of the great men that ultimately came to be known, and they would go to sit at the feet of these women to learn about Islam. So I think that there perhaps is too much rigidity to just looking at prophecy, because prophecy is something that it's a gift from Allah that is completely out of anyone's control, or, you know, and to over-define, I think, might actually be damaging to the notion of, as you're referring to, the truly spiritual great women, and maybe that definition can be expanded a little. But I also wanted to just ask you, what were the 4 women that were highly regarded? It was Maryam and Asiya.
Moses' mother.
And
Khadija or Aisha, depending.
Yeah, those
on
are the 4 that are well known.
This is from the Sunni Hadith tradition. Maybe I should have mentioned that the issue of prophecy is not outside, let's say, doctrines which govern the social relations within Muslim society. So you will find often in explanations of males' guardianship over women as predicated on men having a higher degree of women, and the evidence of male superiority is that God chose them to be his prophets rather than women. So it's not like a topic that's no longer relevant because prophecy was sealed, and now we can just talk about women who are friends of God, awliya or saints, or that we're kind of projecting, let's say, a Western scholarly agenda on Islamic theology. It's at the heart of the various structures which see women in asymmetrical relations to men. And yeah, I mean, it comes up in so many contexts as the evidence for male superiority. So you can't escape from tackling that, that question. Also, I've been asked that quite often, am I not bringing, let's say, a feminist or an analytical question that comes from gender theory and kind of, imposes an episteme or a framework of knowledge on Islamic tradition and diverts us from the real question is how do we achieve, a degree of spirituality and greatness, etc. I would say, given the range of engagement, it's not a modern question. It has been a question that we see across time, across place. They were concerned with that question. Should we ignore it and say, okay, if we bring it up today, then we're kind of, inscribing the Islamic tradition within a feminist liberal agenda? I think, a nuanced position for me is one that does not succumb to the binary of you either accept what there is or reject it and adopt a different agenda from outside it. So neither liberal feminism nor traditionalism are, for me, a way forward, because I think we need to keep asking a critical question about the two horizons coming together. How do we bring them together? What do we get out of that? When do we create boundaries? When do we have a productive reflection on what the tradition might be saying, or what liberal feminism or gender theory might be saying? Some of my work is actually a critique of gender theory and its limits, because it does not, and it will not consider the metaphysical. It will...
It's really important work, and I think brilliant work needs to be done. I just think that the fear I have, as I say, I'm an equality lawyer, so I really enjoy the idea of all of these things being explored beautifully in public. But what I find interesting is that there's this fabulous little interview with Toni Morrison, where this chap says to her, well, when are you going to write a proper book about, white people, effectively? And she sort of said, well, I am writing a proper book in my context. And I always go back to that, because I think that sometimes the lens can be so broad, and the questions that are asked have to be from a lens that isn't just sitting in modern Western, modern Western mindset. But as you say, there's so much historic.
Yeah, and the fusion of these horizons, or the bringing of these inquiries together, and also projecting back the critical lens onto gender theory. As I said, Much of gender theory that I read, that I try to use, is problematic because there's no space for understanding a metaphysics of gender that is not, accepting that everything is political and everything is secular. So, yeah, there isn't a non-secular gender theory, as it were. So that constrains me, and that's a problem. So I try to write and engage in a critique. Some might call it decolonial critique. And one of the things that I hope to do in this book, inshallah, is to try to find whether one could develop an episteme that is contextualized, of course, but that draws on the Islamic tradition, but doesn't necessarily repeat the views, but uses the concepts in helpful ways. So we don't need to repeat the views of all these scholars, but can we get something from them that is perhaps more appropriate to our context and push gender theory beyond its limits?
I'm sure we've got a lot more questions for Dr. Naguib, but that is all the time we've got today. Thank you again, Dr. Naguib.